Hello and welcome to the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. A lot of fallout from the election. Also, a lot of you getting in touch with us. Remember, if you want to get in touch, it's ponsonbymassey@gmail.com. That's by email and by X, what was formerly Twitter, @PonsonbyMassey. And let's start with some points that have come up from Twitter. Peter Hardy, Ian Jones and Michael Apter have been in touch. I'm just going to read the 3 points and questions because they all talk to a certain theme. Peter said, should the electoral system be changed or should parties just play the system? Ian Jones, did Labour win the election in Scotland or did the SNP lose it? Some are trying to suggest Labour's win lacks legitimacy because of low turnout and low vote share. Is this something that applies north of the border? And Michael Apter said, should Labour and Keir Starmer deal with electoral reform head on? Would making it a priority in this Parliament head off any possibility of an SNP revival ahead of the Holyrood elections? Federalism for the nations and regions, proportional representation to deal with reform. So there's issues about the legitimacy of the Labour mandate, given that the percentage share of the vote was relatively low given what they got. And is there an unambiguous case for electoral reform? Alex?
Well, there's an awful lot to get into there, isn't there, Bernard? The short answer to this is there is no case for electoral reform on the basis of this result. And secondly, in my view, that this question about Labour's victory somehow being compromised or tarnished or in some strange sense diluted by the fact that Labour's share of the vote was relatively low by historic standards, I think is absolutely preposterous. I mean, I recall that when David Cameron won a narrow majority in the House of Commons in 2015 with around 36% of the vote, nobody then suggested that it was an illegitimate victory or compromised in this fashion. And nor is this one. You know, share of the vote is vastly overrated in my view. It is seats that count. And there is absolutely precious little point in racking up huge victories in a small number of constituencies to boost your share of the vote if you, at the same time, don't win the seats that really matter. And one of the features of this election, I think, was the way in which the Labour and the Lib Dem vote was so efficiently distributed. Now, this owed something to a kind of non-aggression pact in England, particularly in the southwest of England and some suburban constituencies where the Lib Dems were strong. There was a tacit agreement, really, that Labour wouldn't make too much effort in those seats and voters would be free to back whichever non-Conservative candidate was best placed to win the seat. And that duly happened. And obviously that's something that we're accustomed to seeing with respect to the SNP in Scotland over several elections now. And so I mean, the Lib Dems' efficiency was remarkable. I mean, they've ended up with 72 seats and they targeted about 75. I mean, this is an extraordinary achievement for the Lib Dems. How durable it is of course a different matter because the circumstances in which the next general election will be fought will be very different. But no, I mean, there is, the rules are the rules, and the fact that Labour only won with 36 or under 36% of the vote, isn't important. And also I would throw this out to you, Bernard, if this had going to be a closer election, then I think Labour's share of the vote would have been higher.
Right, okay. Peter, Ian and Michael, I think, do raise reasonable points. I'm going to disagree with you from this perspective. Is there a case for electoral reform? I think there is unambiguously a case for electoral reform. Will there be electoral reform? Simple answer, no, there won't, because it would involve one of the two big parties, although I'm not sure that we can now describe the Conservatives as a big party. It would require a party of government, which is going to be Labour or Conservative, effectively deciding that the future direction of the country, if they are the largest party in government, will in part be decided by smaller parties. I wrote an article after the 2019 election saying that Labour should seriously consider electoral reform, and in fact they did debate it. It went all the way to the conference floor, and I made the point in the article that there is actually, if you tot up the Labour totals and the Liberal Democrat totals, and now I suppose we have to throw the Greens into the mix, there is probably an anti-Conservative majority in England, and one of the things that electoral reform would do would help marshal that anti-Conservative majority. But of course what happens is that they flip with it at the point of despair, at the point where they think they're never going to win an election. And then when power is on the horizon, these debates do tend to be shelved. But I did see some stuff from the Electoral Reform Society. Okay, they would say this, wouldn't they? That this was the most sort of disproportionate election. Irony of ironies, that the party that favours electoral reform more than any other, the Liberal Democrats, broadly their share of the vote equates to their share of the seat. Labour, of course, are massively overrepresented with a share of the vote at 36%. The Conservatives are underrepresented. And Reform UK, of course, are massively underrepresented. You're right to say them's the rules, because, you know, back in 2015, 56 out of 59 seats for the SNP on 50% of the vote, massively overrepresented. And of course, when you talk in terms of this is a Labour landslide, this indeed is a Labour landslide in terms of the number of seats that Labour have won. But if you actually look at the share of the vote and you look at the Tory share of the vote, allied to the Reform share of the vote, you know, it's not a landslide in terms of votes. The other thing, of course, which you pointed out, again quite rightly, is the electorate have become very sophisticated at finessing the system. So people in southern constituencies who don't want to vote for the Conservatives and know that Labour have no chance will vote tactically for the Liberal Democrats. I mean, first past the post actually almost incites tactical voting, whereas, of course, if you have a proportional system, you vote for who you want because you believe in them and you know that your vote won't be wasted. So is there a case for electoral reform? Of course there is. There is absolutely a case for electoral reform. Is it going to happen? The short answer to that is that it is not going to happen, because Labour are simply not going to embrace it.
And we have had a referendum on electoral reform quite recently, and it was summarily rejected. Now, admittedly, that was quite a strange thing in the coalition, Conservative Lib Dem government, where David Cameron did Nick Clegg up like a complete kipper. And the Lib Dems ended up having to argue for a form of electoral reform they didn't believe in, which was absolutely priceless.
Can we just correct this? What we had was a referendum and another version of first past the post. Let's get this right. The alternative votes model was...
but that still would count in the circumstances as electoral reform. First past the post
depends how you're defining reform.
System. Well, sure. But speaking of reform, one of the things that First Past the Post does do is it marginalises extremist candidates and extremist parties. And although obviously Reform and the pro-Gaza independents that have been elected have got a toehold in this parliament, if you had a truly proportional system, then you would have an awful lot more extremists with disproportionate amount of influence in parliament based on their share of the vote. And so, there are significant downsides to every electoral system, frankly. But I don't think that the particular details of this result make any kind of a compelling case for changing it. The mood of the country was quite clear. And as I say, in a strange way, because Labour was sort of 20 points ahead in the opinion polls for all the campaign, even if the final result didn't end up matching with that quite exactly, that actually gave a lot of people license to vote for independent or Reform or other candidates, knowing that the overall result of the election was not in doubt. And I think that was one of the things that helped shore up the Conservative vote in Scottish constituencies, actually, because it allowed pro-union, pro-UK voters to cast an anti-SNP vote without risking the return of a Conservative government that many of them wouldn't actually have welcomed. And so, there are lots of nuances within voting patterns in this country now. But I don't think, electoral reform, as you say, it's not going to happen. But I'm not sure that anything about this particular election result really advances or strengthens the case for change.
Okay, let's move on to another issue. Just before we do, I did mention that Labour's share of the vote at 36. Of course, it was 24 for the Conservatives. So the actual sort of a difference between the Labour and Conservative percentage shares was about 11, 12 points or so. Every opinion poll, just about every opinion poll, was giving Labour a 20-point lead. And I would have thought the opinion pollsters will want to revisit a question which they tend to revisit after every election. Why do the polls understate the Conservatives and overstate Labour? But let's go on to... We're going to cover them. No, we have to move on. We have to move on. Okay. We have to move on. Are we going to get bogged down on the one issue? Right, Andrew Brophy. Now, Andrew Brophy is a name that I remember. He was, in 1989, the SNP's candidate in Glasgow at the European elections. Big social media profile, always very, very thoughtful in his observations. He says, how do you explain that despite the huge fall in support for the SNP, the poll figure for independence has hardly moved? The voters are deeply unimpressed by Alapa also. I know the priorities argument, etc., but that can't be the full explanation. And let's take Andrew's question in conjunction from one from LTW Anderson, who got in touch via Twitter to say, your thoughts on Sturgeon's position after her car crash petted lip appearance as a political guru on ITV. I'm going to suggest, in order that we can get as much in as possible, you deal with the Andrew Brophy question, and I will deal with the one about Nicola Sturgeon's political punditry on ITV.
Well, it's an excellent question because there is obviously now a significant gap has opened up between support for the SNP and support for independence. Now, in some respects, this is a reversion to old ways of thinking. You know, if you think in the 1980s, the 1990s, support for independence, albeit as a purely hypothetical matter, was often much greater than support for the SNP. And we're now back in that position, at least for the time being. And I think that reflects a view that independence is partly a state of mind. It's partly a badge of identity for some voters. And it's also at present, as I say, a hypothetical consideration because there is no prospect of an independence referendum at any point in the next parliament. And so it is functionally off the table for a number of years. And so what is the true support for independence? Well, that depends. If there was a detailed offer, a detailed prospectus, and people had to make a choice right now, would support for independence shift? It might not. The challenge for the SNP after this result is how do you close that gap? And you have a lot of people who are saying, people like Joanna Cherry, Alex Neil, and others who are suggesting that, even Nicola Sturgeon, actually, we didn't press the independence issue hard enough, which I think is a very interesting analysis and thoroughly wrong-headed. It's a bit like the Conservative analysis saying that we lost lots of votes to Reform because we weren't sufficiently right-wing enough. I think that's just not the case. The Conservatives and the SNP have both been damaged by a lack of competence or a perceived lack of competence, on a whole range of issues. The Conservatives have suffered more from this than the SNP, but the SNP's decline in the opinion polls has now been going on for a couple of years. It started in the tail end of Nicola Sturgeon's administration and has continued under Humza Yousaf. And although John Swinney may have arrested the slide, the fact remains that the SNP is currently polling at 30%. And that's not because they haven't been talking about independence enough. I would argue it's because they haven't been doing the job as a government that people expect them to. And the more they talk about independence, the worse it is for them, because it alienates voters who are not interested in independence right now.
I'm itching to give an observation on that, but I'm not going to because we want to cover as much ground as possible.
Scratch the itch.
Let's deal with Mr. Anderson's points. Your thought on Sturgeon's position after car crash, petted lip appearance as a political guru on ITV. I don't think that she was. She should have done this, frankly. Why? Because she's on with George Osborne and Ed Balls, one Conservative, one Labour, who are out with elected politics. They can literally say what they want. But when she was asked to do this, they probably would have said, look, we want you to be a pundit. We know that you're SNP and you will defend SNP positions on the programme, but we want you to use your skills as a political analysis to give a commentary on the themes that are developing for the night. Now, the problem with that is that she will have felt the need to be an analyst in part. And in doing that, you have to bring, dare I say it, a degree of honesty about the position of your own party. The other thing is that she probably agreed to do this, thinking probably at worst it'll be eeksy-peeksy between the SNP and Labour, and I can probably just about hold a line when I'm doing this punditry in order that I'm not seen to be pouring cold water over the performance of the party. What, of course, we got was the classic situation where they did particularly badly and it put her in a dreadfully uncomfortable position. And there was a point in the programme where they were interviewing Joanna Cherry from the Edinburgh Account, where Joanna Cherry was more or less laying the blame for much of this result at the door of Nicola Sturgeon, and they had a lovely split screen, a bit like the split screen we have on the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon knew, she wouldn't have seen this, but she would have known there was a split screen, and was trying not to shake her head or look exasperated, but the picture, frankly, told a lot. And of course, in trying to be an analyst at several points, she kept referring to they, but they are actually her parliamentary colleagues. So you had this difficulty where she has to be seen to be trying to defend the party, of which she still represents in Parliament, but be an analyst, and to use one of her expressions of the night, she was caught between two stools. I didn't think that it did her any favours at all. Having listened to what she said and looking at the way in which Balls and Osborne analyse politics, I wouldn't say that necessarily it was an impressive addition for a career as being a political analyst. But then again, I don't think that she should have done this. And one other thing, I just wonder how much ITV were paying her to do this, because I suspect when she enters this fee in her register of interests at Holyrood, you will probably find that the fee for a night's work, albeit an uncomfortable night's work, will probably equate to a sum of money greater than the salary of many people that she represents in Parliament. And I think the optics of that, if you're an elected politician, as opposed to leaving Parliament, so standing down and having a new career, the optics of that will not look good. But let's move on, Alec.
I know. There's a lot that I would like to say in response to all of that, but I'm sure we will circle back to some of these issues in due course. Yes, we got an excellent question from Gordon Dudman by email, which is ponsonbymassey@gmail.com, to remind you. And he asks, did SNP voters simply stay at home, and will they drift back to the SNP when it comes to Holyrood elections in 2026?
I think probably a number of SNP members did stay at home. I think that's the view of many people who were canvassing for the SNP. You could say they would say that, wouldn't they? Because they have to come up with some sort of reason for this result. But given that turnout across the UK was not brilliant at 60%, I mean, here in Glasgow, for example, the constituency in which I reside, Glasgow North East, the turnout was below 50%. It was hurtling just over 50% in other Glasgow constituencies. So it was well down. I think there probably was an issue of differential turnout. I think it probably did harm the SNP, but you simply cannot explain away the huge swings to Labour, 22% in that first declaration in Kilmarnock and Loudon. Huge swings to Labour of by-election proportions, unless people were moving straight from the SNP over to Labour. And some of the polling commentary that I saw from John Curtis during the course of the election suggested that about 25% of people who were in the SNP camp last time were intending to vote Labour. So there's been a hemorrhaging of votes away. And of course, this explains the difference between the share of the vote for the SNP being much, much lower than the share of the vote for independence. Will they go back? I think that we're now into a really fascinating situation where we could get, and I suppose the electoral system for Holyrood was always designed to give everybody a shout. We could have a situation after the next Holyrood election where, because it's proportional, and Labour with a 6-point lead, let's say the result was translated into the Holyrood poll in 2026, you would have 36 for Labour, 30 for the SNP, whatever it is, 13 for the Tories. You could have a parliament where the Labour figure, let's say for argument's sake they are the largest party, the Labour figure plus the Liberal Democrat figure doesn't get you to 65, then start talking about rainbow coalitions and throwing in the Greens, and you barely get to 65. I mean, it could be a really fascinating election in 2026. The SNP, even if their vote share falls, will not be punished as much because of the electoral system.
Absolutely. What you lose on the swings of first past the post constituencies, you gain on the regional list seats, on the roundabouts of the regional list seats, and that will offset some of the problems that the SNP have. The more fundamental issue. There are certainly a lot of people who think that, there'll be a discrepancy between the way people will vote in a Westminster election, where the SNP are more marginalised because they can't form a government, and the way that people will vote in a Holyrood election, where it is about choosing a government, and the SNP can always play the card that we are the party that will stand up for Scotland's national interest against whoever happens to be in power in the House of Commons, and that is a good and plausible and reasonable argument for the SNP to make, and often, as we have seen in the past, a persuasive one as well. That is the glass half full theory that you will currently hear in SNP circles. The glass half empty one is, and this is what you will hear from Labour people, is that, look, this was a change election after 14 years of Conservative administration in Westminster. The next Holyrood election in 2026, the SNP will have been in power for 19 years. If there was a compelling argument for change after 14 years of Tory government, might there not be an equally compelling argument for change after 19 years of SNP administration? And I think that is the kind of fundamental message that a lot of voters will find fairly persuasive. They will think it reasonable. And the difficulty for the SNP is, how do you reinvigorate yourself as you're seeking it'll be a fifth term? That is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to do that, I think, when you're led by John Swinney, who was, after all, first leader of the party 20 years ago. That's not to say that he's a bad or an incompetent leader, but, how does he really present himself as the voice of a new Scotland? I think that's very difficult. And the fallout from this election campaign is going to be very difficult for the SNP to manage as well, because the party is not united. There is a lot of unhappiness, and so we shouldn't assume, I think, that there will be a sort of bounce back from this election result at Holyrood in 2026, albeit a lot can happen in the next 18 months.
Okay, let's round it off with a couple of points, one from Andrew McCall, one from Mark Brown. Andrew McCall is an avowed Yesa and Alapa member who said that the spirit of 2014 that shot this SNP into the air has faded. Not so much a question as an observation, but Mark Brown says, is there a silver lining for the SNP in that it buried Alapa at the election? The straight answer to that, Mark, is no, because in reality there was nothing to bury. Alapa made their debut. Alapa made their debut at the Scottish Parliament elections, didn't get anywhere at the poll last Thursday. And I would, if I was an Alapa member, would be asking myself a couple of questions. The first question that I would ask, why is it that Alapa, who have been in existence now for a few years, who are led by someone who is a former First Minister, got lamentable shares of the vote, including shares of the vote for the two members of Parliament that they had in the last Parliament. I mean, lost deposits comfortably, not making 2% of the poll. And yet, a party that was formed a matter of weeks ago, which is an anti-immigration English nationalist party. Let me repeat that. An anti-immigration English nationalist party was comfortably outpolling ALPA by a factor of about, 7, 8. I mean, that really should
you're talking about reform there, and outpolling the Greens,
yes.
which I thought was very interesting.
So I would ask that question. And the second question, I think, is that ALPA are actually paying a price because they have not, I think, really decided what it is they want to do with the SNP. They've been playing softly. The crude reality is this. The SNP are not going to work with ALPA as part of any grand coalition to marshal the independence forces on the list vote in 2 years' time. And just as many years ago, when Social Democrats broke away from the Labour Party in 1981, the SDP as a political project were only going to fly if they garnered votes from the party from where they came. And they did do that. You have no traction in politics unless you actually win votes. And the fact is that ALPA should be in the market for getting SNP votes. They should also be in the market for banging the drum for their own strategic raison d'etre. Now, in fairness, they do this. They've had conferences, they've put out lots of press releases. They are probably underreported, but they've missed, I think, open goals, like putting up a candidate in the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. But they seem to have been playing softly with the SNP, hoping that they can come to some accommodation. It ain't going to happen because they're not getting any votes. They have no traction, and therefore there's no reason why the SNP would deal with them. But that doesn't mean that in terms of the broader independence debate, that they don't actually have a legitimate point of view, because it does appear to me that on independence strategy, ALPA have something to say and ALPA have something to offer, whereas the SNP are just sort of stuck in a strategic pickle. They do not know what to do. But for that strategy for ALPA to gain any kind of momentum, they have to start winning votes. And that means that they have to start going after the SNP, not sort of taking a, well, we hope that we can get into some sort of big tent politics with them, because it ain't happening.
Well, yes, I mean, I agree with all of that, but I think their fundamental problem is that most voters view them as an Alex Salmond vanity party. And Alex Salmond is one of the most unpopular politicians in the country. This is something that he has not yet come to terms with, but voters certainly have. And that places a hard ceiling on their viability, I think. They can make a lot of noise and they can say that the SNP are selling out the independence cause. But fundamentally, this again is asking voters to believe in something that they don't believe. Nobody doubts the SNP's commitment to independence. But there isn't a great enthusiasm for reopening the national question right now. That's not to say there won't be at some point in the future, but right now there's no prospect of that happening. And so, the ALBA dreams of, unilateral declaration of independence or whatever it is that you have to do to outflank the SNP on the nationalist side of the argument and so on is just delusional. And most voters see that. And they think, why would I bother wasting my time with people like that?
Okay, well, that's a sort of diametrically opposed point of view. Good. At least we're getting some disagreement. I was just going to end with a very quick tweet which has come in. It's from Mr. A. Salmond Stricken. Will you please tell Massie to shut up? Well, I can report to Mr. A. Salmond Stricken that he has shut up, at least for this episode of the podcast. From me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.